Hi, I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and today I'm going to show you how to applique onto fake fur. This is a great way to add eyes or mouths or bellies to a softie that's made with faux fur. This is the pattern piece that I'm working with, and I've cut out the body shape. I have another video where I showed you how to cut out the fake fur without cutting away the pile. So the next step in this is to add the eye and the mouth to it. So I need to applique those shapes onto the fur. You can't use fusible because you can't iron stuff to the fur. You definitely do not want to hand sew it down because hand sewing on fur like this is kind of a crazy nightmare. And you don't want to use the normal machine applique technique I use because that involves just folding a raw edge under, and you don't want to mess with that little raw edge and the fur that moves. So I've got another method that I'm going to show you. So the first thing we're going to do is prepare the eyeball to go on this monster. And for that, we're going to go over to the ironing board. The first thing you're going to do is just trace the eyeball shape onto a piece of fabric. So you would want to trace it just onto a single layer of fabric. No seam allowance or anything, just trace right on that line. And then you're going to layer it with a second piece of fabric. In this case, I just folded it in half. So the next step that you're going to do is sew right on that line. And I didn't bother, I'm not going to show you that on the video because that would be kind of boring. So I have a piece where it is sewn. And I sewed it in a dark thread so you could really see it. Normally you would want to sew this with white thread to match the white fabric. And you sew it all the way around. Don't leave any seam allowance. You want it to be a nice, perfectly smooth edge. The next step is going to be to cut away your seam allowance. And you want to cut it fairly close to that line of stitching. You just work your way around it till you get to the edge. Now, this doesn't have any concave curves to it, but if it did, you would want to clip into that seam allowance, just like you would with sewing any curve. So the next thing we need to do is turn this right side out. So you're going to pinch it and separate the two layers. And you're going to cut just into one of the layers. This is going to be the back of the eyeball. And I just cut a little snip. Now I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so I can get my fingers in there. And now I'm going to turn it right side out. You're going to get a nice smooth curve all the way around. And to really smooth that curve out, I'm going to get my stick and just work my way around the eyeball and work all of those little bits into a nice smooth curve. Then I'm going to flip it back over, make sure everything's nice, and then I'm going to hit it with the iron and some steam. And now you have a nice round eyeball ready to applique. You can see that cut through there a little bit. Ideally, I would have used a slightly thicker fabric, but this will work okay. So you've got a nice eyeball finished on one side. The back side has that slit in it, but you're never going to see it. And now we're going to sew it onto the monster face. So here's our fur, here's our pattern. This is not fun to mark on, so I'm going to teach you a little trick here. This eyeball starts almost 2 inches down from the point of the fabric. This dotted line is the seam allowance, this is the cut line. So I'm going to set this up, and I'm going to set my eyeball right at that measurement down from the top. And now I know that my eye is placed down, and I'm going to just make sure it's centered. I'm going to push so that I'm not seeing the fur, I'm feeling the edges of the fabric, and yep, it's centered side to side. So I'm going to pin that in place, just a pin in the middle. I want it to stay out of the way of the machine. And now I'm going to make sure that my fur is all smoothed down because I'm going to sew all around the edge here, and however the fur is underneath that stitching line, it's going to be that way forever once I sew it. So I want to make sure that all my fur is going down like it's supposed to. And then we're going to take it over to the machine. Okay, I'm just going to use a simple straight stitch on this. Since it's finished all the way around, I don't need to worry about finishing raw edges and doing zigzag stitching or anything like that. I'm just going to do a simple straight stitch. If the fur is really fat, you might want to make your stitch length a little bit longer to account for that. But this fur is not so fluffy that I feel like I need to do that. It's stitching along just fine. You're just going to work your way around the eyeball. Again, make sure your fur is smoothed down, especially when you start going in the opposite direction of the fur. It can kind of push it up a little bit. Now, I'm just going to lift this up so I can get my fingers under there. I want to make sure that everything is pressed flat as I come back to the beginning of my stitching. And there we're back to the beginning. So I'm going to back stitch and take it out of the machine. I'm going to cut that thread really close. Cut the thread underneath. We can pull it out. And take the pin out now. And we'll go back to the work table and I'm going to show you a couple more little tricks. So this is what it looks like right now, straight out of the machine. I'm going to take him and I'm going to give him a good shake. Now, this is what he'll look like when he's being played with. Sometimes, especially if it's an eyeball, I want him to have a little bit of a look like he's got his hair in his eyes, like he has kind of shaggy hair. So I might pull a little bit of this fur out of the stitching, not too much, just a little bit. And then I'll mess with it a little bit more. But then you'll see when you smooth it back down, you have a little bit of hairiness hanging down over his eyes, and it gives him a more shaggy look. You don't have to do that. It's totally a preference, and I do it with some softies and not with others. So I want to show you one more thing. The next thing to stitch down would be the mouth, and I just wanted to show you this piece. I'm not going to sew it down because we would do it just like we did the eyeball, but I prepared this exactly the same way that I prepared the eyeball. If I flip it over, you can see that it's got the hole in the back where I turned it over, where I flipped it over. I just wanted to point out a couple of things. When you're not doing a circle, I did clip off the excess fabric at the points there so that the points wouldn't be too bulky. And I also clipped into the seam allowance in this concave curve before I turned it right side out so it would get a smooth curve. I have another video that shows how and why to do that. I just wanted to remind you that you need to do it on these also. It's just like any other stitching. After I turned it right side out and pressed it, then I attached these little teeth just with some fusible applique, and then I, with the paper-backed fusible adhesive, and then I stitched over the edges just to make the teeth extra secure. So that's how I prepared that piece, and then I will stitch it down just like the eyeball. And just like the eyeball, I'm not going to try and mark on this fabric. I'm just going to measure on the pattern piece how far down it gets positioned. And that's it. So that's it. It's surprisingly easy to applique on a furry fabric once you know the tricks. One is how to prepare the pattern pieces or the applique pieces so that they're finished all the way around, and then that makes the sewing really easy because you're just doing straight stitches all the way around the edges. I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World. I'll see you next time.